The horrifying incident occurred when Paul was stationed as a soldier. One night, a confrontation erupted with a group of illegal arms smugglers. The military forces had to retreat and withdraw. However, their withdrawal caused many soldiers to scatter into the forest in different directions, inadvertently entangling themselves in a terrifying ordeal. Before we dive into our scary story, we would like to ask everyone to like and subscribe to support us in continuing to bring you more terrifying tales in the future. We need to go back around the year 1937. At that time, Paul was serving in the military and was called to duty in a district in Kanchanaburi province. The primary reason for deploying soldiers there was because the forest in that area was experiencing illegal entries into the country, as well as illegal logging and weapons trafficking. The unit Paul was attached to was stationed there to address these issues. Paul and his unit had been stationed at that camp for about a month. The soldiers had managed to secure the area to a reasonable extent, allowing them to travel around without needing to rely on maps. One night in October, Paul clearly remembered it was the 13th. He heard the sound of an old train passing through the area, which was a routine occurrence every night at the same time. However, that night something seemed off. Shortly after the sound of the steam engine started, there was the sudden sound of gunfire, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged along the rails. The soldiers all heard these noises and unanimously agreed that it sounded like the train had made an abrupt stop, and the noise was very loud. Following this, there was a crashing sound as if the train had collided with something large placed on the tracks. At that moment, Paul's team hypothesized that there might have been an attempt to rob the train. They quickly organized a team and headed to the source of the sound, which took them a considerable amount of time to reach. Despite the delay, they arrived at the scene just in time. At the location where they heard the train noises, they discovered illegal weapons being smuggled by some ill-intentioned individuals via the train. Upon arrival, gunfire immediately erupted, echoing through the forest. Even though the bandits were outnumbered, they were not easy to defeat as they were equipped with more advanced weaponry and had a strategic advantage over Paul's unit. Several soldiers were injured or killed in the confrontation. The bandits gradually tightened their encirclement around the outnumbered soldiers, forcing the unit leader to order a retreat to avoid further casualties. The plan was to split into smaller teams to divert the enemy's attention. Paul and a few other soldiers took a different path and provided covering fire to allow their comrades to retreat. The situation was chaotic. After some time, Paul realized that his team, initially larger, was now down to only 2 soldiers besides himself, making 3 in total. The plan at that point was to throw grenades at the bandits' hiding spots and use the confusion to escape in different directions: north, south, and east. After escaping, they were to regroup at the camp. At that critical moment, each soldier was trying to save their own life, and they had to wait until the bandits vacated the area before they could regroup. When the explosions signaling the dispersal sounded, all the remaining soldiers scattered in different directions. Paul, for his part, navigated through the dark forest with no light or guide. Many times he was scratched by thorns and branches, causing his whole body to sting. Moreover, the bandits had spread out to hunt down as many fleeing soldiers as possible. At that moment, there was no time for them to linger. The entire forest turned into a green hell filled with the light of bullets. Paul ran for a long time until the sound of footsteps, initially loud, gradually faded with distance. This was a good sign, as it meant he had managed to escape beyond the bandits' reach. However, Paul had no idea where to go next and could only continue weaving through the forest. If he were lucky, he might find a stream to drink from, as the exhaustion from running for his life had left his throat parched and his saliva sticky. While wandering aimlessly through the forest, Paul suddenly heard singing from not far away. He cautiously moved towards the sound, thinking it might be from forest dwellers who had settled in the area. If it was indeed a village, he could then plan whether he could hide there. It didn't take long for Paul to follow the sound out of the forest, where he saw two villagers standing guard at what seemed to be the village entrance. The village was enclosed with bamboo fences and white ropes. Inside, some sort of ritual was taking place. The two villagers didn't seem very friendly. They had stern expressions and remained silent, each holding a crossbow. Paul watched from his position in the forest for a while, and once he was confident that his weapon was more powerful, he decided to reveal himself and walk towards the two villagers. As soon as the villagers saw Paul, they signaled him to stop and pointed their crossbows at him. Seeing this, Paul raised his hands to show that he came in peace. The villagers stared at Paul for a moment, then began communicating with him in Thai, though with an unfamiliar accent. It didn't take long for them to understand each other. The villagers explained that they were guarding the entrance because recently, several villagers had mysteriously died. They believed these deaths were caused by what they called forest spirits. Initially, when they saw Paul, they thought he was a forest spirit in disguise, trying to lure them out of the village's protective boundaries. The bamboo fence Paul had seen was a protective barrier created by the village shaman. After their conversation, one of the villagers ran into the village to fetch others, bringing Paul inside the village. There, Paul met the village headman, who had a thick beard and looked like a forest bandit. The first thing the headman did was take Paul to see the village shaman, who was performing a ritual. The shaman, named Ash, was asked to check whether Paul had brought any forest spirits into the village. Shaman Ash circled around Paul for a while before speaking in a raspy voice, advising Paul not to leave the village boundaries at night, no matter what he saw or heard. If in doubt, he should call a villager to check if what he saw was a person or a spirit. Shaman Ash emphasized that the village had many unexpected dangers. If Paul wanted to survive and see the sunrise again, he must follow the villagers' advice. Paul nodded in agreement respectfully. That night, the villagers arranged for Paul to sleep in a hut. As he lay there, his mind wandered to the events that had transpired, worrying about his fellow soldiers and wondering if the bandits had retreated. As he pondered these thoughts, he eventually drifted off to sleep, though not deeply, likely due to the stress weighing on his mind. Paul didn't know how long he had slept when he was awakened by a strange noise near his ear, sounding like a dog gnawing on a bone. The sound was so close that he decided to get up and peek out of the hut's window. He saw someone kneeling on the ground, eating the remains of several animals scattered around. Paul was about to ask who the person was, but before he could, a group of villagers came running towards the hut, shouting that they had found it and it was right there. They carried torches and chased the person who was eating the carcasses. The torchlight illuminated the face of the mysterious figure, revealing it to be a man with bulging veins all over his face, making him look terrifying. This sight prompted Paul to reach for his gun and hold it tightly. As the villagers rushed towards the man, he roared like a wild animal, causing the villagers to stop in their tracks, fear evident on their faces. The man then turned to look at Paul through the window, and Paul saw that the man's eyes were entirely black, with no whites, and his teeth were sharp like those of a shark. They locked eyes for a few seconds before the man roared at Paul and then leaped into the darkness behind the hut, moving like a wild animal. In a split second, Paul's soldier instincts kicked in. Without hesitation, he gripped his gun and ran after the villagers, questioning them about what they had just witnessed. The villagers explained that it was the spirit of a forest ghost that had taken over a human body. They briefly told Paul that if it were merely a spirit, it could only haunt and scare people. However, once it possessed a human body, it could do anything and was much stronger than an ordinary person. When it fully took over a body, it would use that body to hunt. The night's tranquility was shattered, replaced by the commotion of villagers searching for the creature that had vanished into the darkness beyond the village. Paul joined the villagers, and they sternly instructed him to kill the creature if he saw it because the person it possessed was already considered dead. They explained that shooting it was the only way to end the terror and prevent the host's suffering. Despite their efforts, they could not find the creature that night. They tracked its footprints for a while, but the tracks abruptly ended, leaving them unsure of its direction. Consequently, the hunt had to be called off for the night. The next morning, the village shaman began a ritual early, as nighttime rituals were not possible. The shaman started by meditating to determine if the creature was still in the village. He announced that the forest ghost had left its host's body the previous night, abandoning the body at the forest's edge opposite the village. The shaman warned that it would return to the village within a few days. The spirit had left to avoid being harmed while possessing the body. It only took over the body to absorb the human soul and then reverted to its original form. This strategy made it nearly impossible to catch or kill it. Paul found the situation incredibly strange, something a city dweller like him never imagined could be real. The villagers told Paul that if the spirit had seen or stared at someone, it would return to harm that person. This revelation meant that Paul was now inadvertently entangled in the villagers' beliefs and their struggle against the forest ghost. In the evening of that day, everyone in the village gathered for another meeting to organize guards and plan how to deal with the evil spirit, as the shaman had predicted that it would return, possibly that very night or any night. In the morning, several villagers had moved away to stay elsewhere, but many chose to stand their ground. Paul decided to stay and help the villagers, feeling indebted to them for providing him refuge. Without the village, he might have perished in the forest. The shaman once again encircled the village with a sacred thread. Despite its previous ineffectiveness, it boosted the villagers' morale. The ritual focused on the headman's house, which they planned to use as the main stronghold, gathering as many villagers as possible there. As the last light of day disappeared behind the mountains, an unfamiliar cold swept into the area. The shaman warned everyone not to go outside, as the sudden drop in temperature signaled the arrival of the spirits, who were now just waiting for the right moment to strike. Villagers stared at the ground in fear, their sweaty foreheads reflecting the torchlight, revealing their anxiety and apprehension. That night, torches were lit all around the village. The shaman sat on the porch, chanting incantations, while some villagers stood outside to monitor the situation, leaving the courtyard empty. Suddenly, the roar of wild animals echoed from a nearby forest corner, a sound Paul had never heard before. It included the fluttering of startled birds and the growls of various animals. The shaman loudly warned everyone to be cautious as the spirits had arrived. The headman quickly ushered everyone into the house, leaving only the shaman chanting on the porch. Paul observed the outside scene through a window. He saw the shaman chanting, trembling as if he were possessed. The intense wind extinguished all the torches, plunging the area into darkness. The villagers sat quietly, waiting for the next development. Soon, the windows slammed shut, and the house was filled with the sound of scraping, as if something hard was being dragged along the walls. Paul cautiously opened a window to check on the shaman, who was still chanting, his body shaking violently. The scraping sounds grew louder, accompanied by an eerie laugh, and a shadowy figure resembling smoke appeared on the porch where the shaman sat. The dark cloud attempted to attack the shaman but couldn't penetrate the protective barrier. The shaman's chanting grew louder, prompting everyone to look outside. When the evil spirit couldn't harm the shaman, it targeted the house, shaking it violently with each strike. Realizing the spirit had changed targets, the shaman moved inside the house, continuing his chant. Suddenly, something hit the floorboards, causing everyone to jump. The gaps between the wooden planks allowed them to see underneath the house. Paul and the villagers peeked through the gaps, seeing the black smoke forming a tall human-like shape, pacing back and forth, searching for an entry point. While everyone was watching, the shaman suddenly shouted, "This won't end unless the young soldier comes with me. The spirit's target is you. Don't forget to bring your gun. Aim for its head and shoot when I tell you. Otherwise, the whole village will perish." After Shaman Ash finished speaking, he removed his amulet necklace and other protective charms, as well as his shirt, revealing his body covered in tattooed, sacred inscriptions. He then reached into his pouch, took out something to chew on, and handed all his amulet necklaces to Paul. At that moment, Shaman Ash looked at Paul with a very serious expression and said, "Our fates are intertwined." Paul was confused by what he heard, but before he could ask any questions, Shaman Ash anointed a torch with some substance and lit it. He instructed Paul to follow him, leaving the rest of the villagers to stay in the house. Shaman Ash told the villagers, "If you hear gunshots, come to the large tree in the village. Remember, this young soldier is our helper." He then had a brief conversation with the headman, who, after listening, looked troubled. The headman then led Paul downstairs. As they descended, Shaman Ash reiterated to Paul, "Aim for its head. When I tell you to shoot, do it without hesitation." The atmosphere outside was chaotic, with a strong wind blowing like a summer storm. Trees swayed wildly, creating eerie shadows that resembled towering figures waving their arms. Paul was especially astonished that the flame on Shaman Ash's torch did not flicker at all despite the strong wind. Shaman Ash led Paul to an open area not far from the headman's house, where a large banyan tree provided shade during the day. The sight of the tree surprised Paul again, as its branches, which had been swaying in the wind, now stood eerily still once they approached. As Shaman Ash had predicted, the dark cloud of smoke gathered at the base of the banyan tree, forming into a human-sized figure. Shaman Ash instructed Paul, "Wait here, do not follow me." He then walked toward the strange figure. Unexpectedly, the figure dissolved into smoke and quickly rushed at Shaman Ash, knocking him to the ground. Shaman Ash convulsed violently as if possessed. Paul stood in shock until Shaman Ash began to rise again, but in an unnatural, animal-like manner, on all fours like a wild beast. This reminded Paul of the mysterious man he had seen on the first night. Instinctively, Paul raised his rifle but hesitated to shoot. The shaman-turned creature charged at Paul, who stood about 80 meters from the tree. Just as Paul hesitated, he heard Shaman Ash's voice whispering in his ear, "Shoot now, young man." Paul fired, aiming at what he believed to be the creature's head. The bullet seemed to hit its mark, and he saw the smoke erupt from Shaman Ash's body, accompanied by a horrifying scream. The dark cloud then passed through Paul's body, causing him to lose consciousness immediately. Paul woke up the next morning to find himself back in the headman's house. The first thing he heard was the sound of villagers crying and wailing coming from underneath the house. Paul quickly got up and went downstairs to see what had happened. As expected, under the headman's house, the lifeless body of Shaman Ash lay on a wooden stretcher, surrounded by dozens of villagers. Seeing this, Paul hurried to the scene, fearing that the villagers would blame him for Shaman Ash's death. However, contrary to his expectations, the villagers did not rebuke him. Instead, they expressed their gratitude when they saw Paul had woken up. Despite Paul confessing that he had shot Shaman Ash the previous night while the shaman was possessed, the villagers insisted that he must have been hallucinating. Paul then requested to examine Shaman Ash's body and found no trace of the bullet wound he was certain he had inflicted. This left Paul puzzled, questioning how Shaman Ash had actually died. Paul was confident that he had shot the shaman in the head, yet there was no sign of a bullet wound. Moreover, as a soldier, Paul routinely checked and counted his ammunition. Upon doing so, he realized that not a single bullet was missing. Paul decided to stay in the forest village for 3 more days and nights. During this time, Shaman Ash's body was prepared for the traditional funeral rites. Instead of cremating the body, the headman instructed the villagers to bury Shaman Ash at the base of the banyan tree. Paul noted that during his stay, everything in the village remained calm and normal. After 3 days, Paul safely returned to his military camp. 10 years later, Paul had the chance to visit the village again. By then, the area was no longer a forest, but the banyan tree still stood in its original place. At the base of the tree, there was now a small shrine, which the local villagers seemed to hold in reverence. The amulet necklace that Shaman Ash had given to Paul had since been passed down to his son.